Welcome to Carly Tackle's Building a Raised Garden. Before starting to build a raised garden, there's a few things you want to do to plan it out first before starting your work. The first step is to measure where you want your garden to be. For our dimensions here, we have 27 feet by 10 feet across. I just purchased my 10-foot tongue and groove boards. These particular ones are 6 inches high. I picked these because I can stack them to the right height that I need. In the front, where it's deeper, I'll probably need to stack 3 of these. In the back, I will only need to stack 2 of them to make my ground level. Some things to consider when purchasing the boards is what about the sides and extra space you may need or extra waste you may have with your cuts. So normally you want to plan to purchase a little extra than what you think you need. I ended up purchasing 21 boards for my 27 by 10 foot garden. I also want to put about a foot of soil in the back and then whatever that ends up being in the front to make it level. So consider those. These are not pre-treated. And since we're going to put them with soil and water, we need to do something to take care of them so they don't rot and deteriorate. When I was buying the lumber, I also bought a solid stain. They make a lot of exterior stains, different thicknesses. For this guy, because it's going in the garden and going to be exposed to a lot of water, I picked the more solid stain that has a heavier water repellent system in it. It'll actually go on more like paint than traditional stains. Well, I'm ready to go. I got myself changed in my paint clothes. I got my gloves on. I went ahead and stirred my stain. Stain does not like to be shook. It creates air bubbles. I'm also going to use a paint sprayer when applying it to all these boards. Now this paint sprayer I've used a few times, really like it. Make sure you read the instructions if you're going to use a paint sprayer. There's different nozzles for different types of paints and stains, so make sure you read the instructions before setting out to use one of these. I'll include the link to this in the video description if you guys like how it applies. So the next thing I'm going to do to make it easier to pour into my little staining bin is I'm actually going to apply one of these spouts. You can get these at any hardware store. They're really nice. Keeps the seal tight on this, and then I don't have paint running over the sides. I did put a little bit of water in here to help thin it down. Some of the sprayers say to thin it slightly to help it spray through. Now this paint sprayer specifically says you don't have to thin it down as much as normal. So I got my spout here. I'm just going to pour some into my sprayer. Now this is a water-based stain. If you had an oil-based stain, water isn't going to help you thin it. You're actually going to need to use some thinners. Alright, I'm going to plug it in and give it a few practice shots before applying to the wood, and then we'll get started. I just finished spraying the garden stakes. I wanted to test out my color and spraying techniques on those first before I started on the main boards. Now that I got some paint through the sprayer, I'm going to start applying to all of my tongue and groove boards. Now that I'm done staining these boards, I'm going to move on to my next sections. A few tips with staining. 1. Stain in the shade. Staining does not like direct sunlight. 2. Check your temperatures and humidity levels recommended when staining on your can. Then check your weather forecast. You want to give your boards plenty of time to dry before rain comes. Now that I have the board stained, it's time to take our garden stakes and get them into the ground and start laying out the land for our raised garden bed. Now in the beginning of this video, I talked about doing a 27-foot by 10-foot garden. After putting a few of these in the ground, I determined that's way too large for my size and ran into some other issues with the slope and depth of this garden bed. So instead, I'm making 2 smaller garden beds, one specifically for my asparagus and the rest for the garden. Still be needing a ramp to get into it with my tiller, so you'll still be able to see some of that. For my garden stakes, I ended up purchasing garden stakes that were 24 inches long. That way I had plenty of board underground and above ground to nail my boards too. As you can see, I already hit a few of these stakes into the ground. I picked my highest peak corner and measured the depth that I wanted to start with. For this case, I used 10 inches. After that, every stake I entered, I made sure I leveled with the first stake. So I used a 2x4 and a level to make sure. In some areas, my boards stick above the ground 17 inches compared to the 10 inches in the corner. I used a 3-pound sledge hammer to drive these stakes into the ground. You can also use a regular hammer or a 5-pound sledge hammer if you'd like. Just be careful to hit the board square on so you don't split them. One thing you can do on the corners is actually use 2 of these stakes to form a corner itself, just to give you a little bit more surface area to nail into. It's definitely, you don't have to do this, but I find it a little easier to nail into a bigger area than a skinnier one. So that's what I'm going to do now. Now that you have the garden stakes in the ground, you can start putting on your boards. For this project, I'm going to put the boards along the sides and the back, but I'm not going to put any of the boards along the front. Reason being is I want to rent a truck, go pick up a bunch of dirt, and actually back all the way up to here and shovel it out. Once all the dirt's in a big mound, I'll put on the front boards, level it out, and then I'm ready to start planting. Now it's time to make some cuts. Make sure you measure from the outside of one garden stake to the outside of the other so that you can get the accurate length for your boards. For the corners, one of the things I want to do is use 45-degree angles. That way when you put them together, they make a nice corner versus butting up 2 of the ends and having one end exposed. In order to do that, my measurements, I want to make sure my inside to my inside on the other is the dimensions of the garden stake. So for instance, my garden stakes measured 9 foot 10 3/4. I want to make sure the inside of this bevel and the inside of the bevel down there is that dimension. That way this guy can overhang and the other board coming through will fit just like this. And you have that closed corner. I have my first board resting against the garden stakes, preparing to nail it in. There are a few things I want to check before nailing. One, I want to make sure that the inside of my miter cut lines up to my garden stakes, not the outside. 2, I want to make sure that my garden stake is straight up and down, otherwise it could throw off my other cuts. And then the next thing is to make sure that my board is level. Now I know I'm on a slope and that this is the higher side, so I'm going to nail this down first and then raise it up on the other end to make sure that it is level. For driving in those nails, I used my finished nailer which connects to my air compressor. I went ahead and placed my second board, and before nailing it in, I want to make sure that these tongue and grooves actually get connected. So I'm going to use a rubber mallet and start tapping along the boards, being careful not to bend the tongue portion of the groove. If you have some low spots like I do here, try using a 2x4 to hold that bottom board firm when you start using your mallet to tap them in. If you have some lower spots in the area you want to put your garden, for example, tire tracks ran through there, you can do a few things. One, you can take some boards, like the smaller one that I made here, and actually rip it using a table saw or a circular saw to cut down its height and try to fit it in snug, just to give you a little extra protection from the soil running out. If you just have smaller gaps, you can use weed protection. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go along some of the areas that have gaps and staple the weed protection to the boards. And then that way when the dirt goes in, it actually will hold itself into place by doing that. So that's what I'm going to show you right now. This is one of the strips that I've already cut using basic shears or scissors will work just fine. And you'll notice I cut it quite taller than my gap, and that's because when I staple this on, I want to leave enough room for the soil to actually go on top of it to help weight it in. So I'm going to staple at the very top, but the soil is going to sit here, and then that will help keep it from going out the bottom. So the soil is going to help me keep it in. So let's get this stapled in. To staple the weed protector, I'm going to be using a staple gun connected to my air compressor. Now this came as a kit. I got a brad nailer, a finish nailer, and a staple gun, all with my air compressor. Sometimes I find that using an air compressor helps you with the tasks that normally require a little bit more strength. Example is if I just do a hand nailer, I require more strength of my hand and pressing against it with my arm, whereas the air compressor will do all of that heavy lifting for me. I just have to press the trigger. So I like to use air compressor tools as much as I can to make up for the strength that I do not have in my upper body. Now that we have the dirt in, it's time to put on the front boards. When putting the dirt in, we made sure to keep it raked back to give ourselves plenty of room to work in the front. So I have one more stake to put in, check to see if it's level, and then I can start putting my boards in place. Thanks for watching Carly Tackles Building a Raised Garden. If you like this video, please hit the thumbs up. If you'd like to see more of these videos, please subscribe to my channel. Carly Tackles DIY, tools and gadgets, tips and tricks.